She never ran for office. She never owned a bank. She never commanded a single soldier or signed a single law. Yet for nearly 3 decades, this one woman decided who mattered in the most powerful city in America and who did not. In the gilded, gaslit world of 1880s New York, there existed a force more terrifying to the ambitious wealthy than any financial crash, any government investigation, any public scandal. It was a name, a nod, a single ivory envelope delivered to your door, or pointedly, devastatingly, not delivered at all. Her name was Caroline Astor, and the weapon she used to build her empire was not money, not law, and not force. It was a ballroom. This is the untold story of how one woman engineered absolute social power in an era when women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and were expected to be ornamental rather than powerful. This is the hidden empire of New York's Gilded Age aristocracy, and the shocking truth about how a ballroom list became the most feared document in American society. The question this story answers cuts directly to the heart of how power actually works. How does a woman in a world designed to silence her seize control of the room, and then make the room itself into a throne? The answer will surprise you, because it was never really about the mansions. It was about who she allowed inside them. #ACT2. Context: the world SHE was born into. To understand what Caroline Astor built, you first need to understand the world that made it possible and the chaos that made it necessary. The decades following the Civil War transformed America at a speed that felt almost violent. Between 1865 and 1900, industrial fortunes of a scale the world had never seen began flooding into New York City. Railroad barons, oil magnates, steel kings, and banking dynasties were minting millionaires at a dizzying rate. Men who had been nobodies a generation earlier were now richer than most European monarchs, and they all wanted the same thing: legitimacy. Here is what the history books rarely tell you about the Gilded Age. Money alone was not enough. Raw industrial wealth bought you a mansion and a carriage and a diamond necklace, but it did not buy you a seat at the table that actually mattered. New York in the 1870s operated on a system as rigid and ruthless as any feudal court in medieval Europe. There were the old families, the Knickerbockers, descendants of original Dutch settlers, and then there was everyone else. The old families held something no amount of railroad profit could manufacture: inherited social legitimacy, and they guarded it ferociously because it was the one advantage the newly rich could not simply purchase. But the system was cracking. New money was arriving too fast, too loudly, too relentlessly. The Vanderbilts alone were worth more than some nations. These fortunes did not politely wait at the door, they hammered at it, financed their way around it, and built mansions directly across the street from old money brownstones, daring the establishment to look away. Into this collision between old prestige and new wealth walked Caroline Astor. She saw something no one else had acted upon. The chaos itself was the opportunity. Someone had to draw the line between those who belonged and those who merely thought they did. That vacuum of authority was worth more than any railroad or oil well, because whoever filled it would hold a power that money itself could not dislodge. This story connects to the world you are living in right now. The velvet rope, the exclusive invite list, the follower count that determines whose voice carries further, all descendants of what Caroline Astor built in a New York ballroom in the 1880s. The mechanics of social power have not changed. Only the stage has. #ACT3. Early life: the origin of hunger. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into a family occupying a peculiar and psychologically precarious position in New York society. The Schermerhorns were old Dutch aristocracy. Their name carried genuine historical weight, but like many old families of that era, they possessed prestige in greater quantity than actual financial power. Caroline grew up watching inherited status erode in real time. She watched families with glorious names and shallow bank accounts be slowly, humiliatingly edged aside by the gravitational force of new money. The people who mattered in her parents' world were, decade by decade, being replaced by people who simply had more. For a young woman of Caroline's temperament, observant, proud, acutely sensitive to social hierarchy, this was not merely uncomfortable, it was unacceptable. There is a particular wound that forms not from poverty but from the fear of losing status. It creates a very specific hunger, not for wealth exactly, but for permanence, for the certainty that your place in the world cannot be taken from you by someone who simply arrived with a larger fortune. That wound formed early in Caroline Schermerhorn, and it drove everything that followed. As a young woman, she possessed a gift almost no one around her fully recognized. She understood that the room itself was a statement of power, not the furniture, not the art, not the food. What communicated real power was who you allowed inside and who you turned away. The invitation was the instrument. The guest list was the weapon. In 1853, Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. The Astor name was one of the great fortunes in American history, built on fur trading and Manhattan real estate. William brought vast wealth and a famous name to the marriage, but he brought very little else. He was a disengaged husband who preferred his yacht and his clubs, conducting his life almost entirely away from his wife's ambitions. Caroline understood the terms of the bargain perfectly. She took the Astor name and the Astor fortune. Then she went to work, alone, building something with them that her husband could never have imagined. #ACT4. Opportunity, the door that opened. The opportunity arrived in the 1870s in the form of the Vanderbilts, and it arrived loudly. The Vanderbilt fortune, built on railroads and steamships, was by the 1870s so enormous it dwarfed almost every other private fortune in America. The family was, by any measure, the most financially powerful dynasty in the country, and yet the old guard of New York society refused to receive them. The Vanderbilts were new money. They did not belong. While old money families watched the Vanderbilts with panic and disdain, Caroline saw something no one else was acting on. The old guard was losing. If the line between old society and new money was going to mean anything going forward, someone needed to seize the authority to draw it, definitively and publicly enough that even the Vanderbilts would have to acknowledge it. She decided that person would be her. The risk was extraordinary. She publicly, deliberately snubbed families richer and more publicly powerful than herself. This could have made her look ridiculous, the last defender of a system that had already fallen. Instead, she built a weapon. Her ballroom at 355th Avenue held approximately 400 guests. This was not an accident of architecture. It became a statement of philosophy. If you were not among those 400, you were not, by definition, in society. She had turned a room into a border, and she controlled that border absolutely. The first sign it was working came when the Vanderbilts had to construct an elaborate social maneuver simply to secure Caroline's attendance at one of their parties. Alva Vanderbilt understood that as long as Mrs. Astor refused to receive them, the family's social standing remained perpetually incomplete. No amount of money could fix it. Only one woman could. That was the moment the empire began. #ACT5. Rise, the empire is built. The machinery Caroline Astor built was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its application. The centerpiece was the 400, a concept so precisely calibrated to its moment that it reshaped American social culture permanently. The number roughly corresponded to her ballroom's capacity, but what it represented was far more powerful, an official, publicly acknowledged boundary defining who constituted legitimate New York society. If you were among the 400, you were someone. If you were not, all the money in the world could not change that fact. The genius was not the exclusion itself. Exclusion had always existed. The genius was the explicit nomming of it. By giving the inner circle a number, Caroline gave it a permanence and clarity that mere social snobbery had never possessed. You knew exactly where you stood. Those inside became fierce defenders of the system that protected their status. To administer this empire, Caroline formed one of the most consequential social alliances in American history. Ward McAllister, a Southern-born social architect with an extraordinary gift for ceremony, became her strategist. Where she was the throne, he was the mechanism. Together, they established the Patriarch's Ball, a subscription event organized by 25 men of impeccable social standing. Admission was among the most coveted achievements in America. Exclusion was quietly catastrophic. Her annual January ball became the single most important social event on the New York calendar. Families restructured their winters around it. The season was largely organized around Caroline's movements and judgments. Her Newport estate, Beechwood, served as the summer theater of her power, the standard against which all competing mansions were measured. The most revealing test came in 1883 when Alva Vanderbilt planned a costume ball of extraordinary spectacle, 1,200 guests, months of anticipation, the entire city talking. Caroline's own daughter had been rehearsing a dance number specifically to perform there. There was one problem. Alva had not sent Caroline an invitation because she could not invite a woman upon whom she had never officially called. Caroline chose a third path. She called upon Alva Vanderbilt on her own terms. The invitation followed. She attended, and in doing so she demonstrated what only genuine power can afford. She could change her position entirely without appearing to have lost anything. The Vanderbilts had spent a decade working toward this moment. Caroline granted it in an afternoon and emerged looking more powerful than before. By the late 1880s, Caroline Astor did not merely inhabit the top of New York society. She was its architecture. Men who controlled industries waited anxiously to learn whether they were among the 400. She had built a monopoly, not on goods or territory, but on the most coveted commodity of all, legitimacy. #ACT6, Conflict, the Storm, ARRIVES. The empire held, and then the world it had been built to contain began to change in ways that no guest list could stop. The 1890s brought a new generation who had grown up watching their parents perform elaborate rituals of deference to an aging woman in a ballroom, and found the entire spectacle increasingly difficult to take seriously. Mamie Fish, sharp, irreverent, deliberately theatrical, threw parties designed to mock the stiff formality of Caroline's court. Her gatherings were chaotic, funny, deliberately undignified. People adored them. Tessie Ulrich staged entertainments so extravagant they made Caroline's events look like airless museum exhibitions. These women were not trying to replace Caroline by her own rules. They were discarding the rules entirely. And that was a challenge Caroline's authority had no mechanism to answer. You cannot exclude someone from a system they have already decided to find ridiculous. The competing Newport mansions grew more spectacular each season. The Breakers, Marble House, Belcourt Castle, fortunes poured into stone and marble to prove the new generation needed no one's permission to define magnificence. The emerging gossip press, once deferential, began finding the old guard worthy of satire. Caroline's system was becoming a cultural artifact. But the deepest conflict was private. William Astor had spent their marriage on his yacht, sailing away from the social life his wife had made the center of her existence. He died in 1892, leaving Caroline with the Astor fortune but with the accumulated weight of a marriage that had been, for most of its duration, a performance rather than a partnership. She had ruled alone. She had also lived alone. And underneath everything was something more devastating than any rival. Caroline had built her entire identity on this social throne. She had no interior life that existed independent of it. As the throne began to wobble and the world moved around it, she had nothing else to be. #ACT7, Climax, the defining moment. The final years of the 1890s brought a sight that New York society watched with complicated reverence and sorrow. Caroline was aging, her health was declining, Her mind was loosening its grip on the present, and yet season after season she continued. She dressed in her famous diamond stomacher, the ceremonial jewels she had worn as the insignia of her social office for decades. She wore the Marie Antoinette diamonds that had become as recognizable as a crown. She descended her staircase. She received. She presided. But those who attended in those final years reported something difficult to name. The room felt different. She still performed every element of the ceremony with absolute precision, but the living authority that had once filled the room had become something closer to a monument. New York was watching history, not power. The throne was still there. The queen was still seated, but the kingdom had quietly reorganized itself around other centers. The most haunting coda came in her very final years. As her mind deteriorated, Caroline reportedly began hosting imaginary parties, receiving guests who were not there, conversing with a social world that existed only in her memory. The woman who had spent her life curating exactly who entered her rooms was, at the end, filling those rooms with ghosts. It was neither victory nor defeat. It was the portrait of a life so completely fused with a single performance that, when the performance could no longer continue, there was no private self remaining. She had refused to abdicate, and the world, with the indifference history always shows toward individual power, moved anyway. #ACT8 Aftermath: The Cost of Power. Caroline Astor died in October 1908. She was 78 years old. Within a decade, the architecture she had spent 50 years constructing had largely dissolved. The Patriarch's Ball was discontinued. The 400 became a term of gentle historical curiosity. The rigid season gave way to a far more fluid social world. New York moved on with the casual speed of a city always more interested in the next thing than the last. The mansion at 355th Avenue was demolished in 1926 and replaced by the Empire State Building. The physical instrument of her authority became a skyscraper. New York, as always, built over its past without sentiment. Ward McAllister had already betrayed her unforgivably. In 1890, he published a memoir revealing the inner workings of their social system in gossipy detail. The private language of their power became public entertainment. Caroline never forgave him. He died in 1895, largely excluded from the society he had helped build. Her son John Jacob Astor IV died in 1912 aboard the RMS Titanic, closing the chapter of Astor's social dominance with an image of catastrophic loss rather than inherited grandeur. History was not gentle in its longer assessment. Celebrated in her time as the queen of American civilization, she was reframed in later decades as a symbol of everything cruel and absurd about Gilded Age excess. The machinery of exclusion she perfected, the list, the snub, the deliberate withholding of social legitimacy, left a long shadow. The families shut out, the fortunes spent chasing invitations that never came, the psychological cost of a system that weaponized belonging. None of that was invisible to later generations. She ended her life alone in a great house, hosting parties that no longer existed, queen of a kingdom that had quietly crowned someone else while she wasn't looking. #ACT9 Legacy: Why this story still matters. Caroline Astor did not invent exclusion, but she industrialized it. She gave it a number, a name, a ceremony, and a structure so precisely designed that it functioned as reliably as any financial instrument. The architecture she built did not disappear when she did. It transformed. The 400 became the A-list. The Patriarch's Ball became the Met Gala. The Newport Estate became the Hamptons House. The guest list became the VIP table, the exclusive launch, the private members club. Every mechanism by which modern society divides those who belong from those who merely want to, every velvet rope, every curated invite, every system that turns access into a status symbol, carries the fingerprints of what Caroline Astor designed in a Fifth Avenue ballroom in 1880. The shadow legacy is equally clear. She demonstrated how social exclusion can be deployed as a weapon. The cruelty of the 400 was not incidental, it was structural. The system required losers to function. The invitation only meant something because of everyone who did not receive one. The lesson her life carries forward cuts across every era. The most absolute power does not always announce itself with force, money, or law. Sometimes the most unassailable power is simply the power to decide who is allowed in the room, and to make the room itself mean something. She held no office. She commanded no army. She cast no vote. But for 30 years in the most ambitious city on earth, no one entered the room that mattered without her permission. The story of Caroline Astor is not simply a story about the past. It is a story about the mechanics of belonging, about who gets to draw the line, and what it costs them to hold it. Those questions are not Gilded Age questions. They are being asked right now, in every room where someone decides who is welcome and who is not. The only difference is that today, the ballroom is everywhere. Total word count, ~4050 words.